a letter drenched in scarlet and sealed with death. Welcome to the Via File. I'm your host, Victor Harlow. This growing community amazes me. Tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Your words always bring these mysteries to life. Now, let's begin. The afternoon light at Thornfield Manor possessed that particular quality of autumn in the English countryside, filtering through leaded windows to cast gentle shadows across carpets that had absorbed decades of scholarly discourse and social ritual. Lady Margaret Thornfield moved through her drawing room with the practiced grace of one born to such surroundings, yet there was something in the deliberate care with which she adjusted a spray of chrysanthemums, the slight pause as she surveyed the room, that suggested the weight of more than ordinary hospitality pressed upon her mind. The annual gathering of the Hawthorne Society had always been her particular pleasure, but this year the familiar preparations felt somehow charged with an undercurrent she could not quite name. "The professor has arrived, my lady," announced Graves, appearing in the doorway with that particular discretion that marked 4 decades of devoted service. His silver head inclined with practiced deference, yet even his imperturbable manner seemed touched by the subtle tension that permeated the house. He has expressed considerable interest in the manuscript collection, particularly the Hawthorne correspondence. Lady Margaret's fingers stilled among the flowers. "Indeed, I trust he found everything in order." The question carried more weight than its simple words might suggest, and Graves, with the intuition of long service, recognized the deeper inquiry. "Quite so, my lady, though he did mention that his research had taken what he termed a most fascinating turn. He seemed rather animated by his discoveries." Graves allowed himself the smallest pause before adding, "Mrs. Hartwell wondered if you might wish to discuss the dinner arrangements. There are," she mentioned, "certain considerations regarding the seating." The sound of voices from the entrance hall announced the arrival of Dr. Helena Ashworth, whose cultured tones carried the authority of Cambridge tempered by that particular restraint marking successful women in predominantly masculine fields. She greeted Lady Margaret with appropriate warmth, yet there was something guarded in her manner, a careful control that seemed more pronounced than usual. "Margaret, how delightful to see you again. The manor looks magnificent, as always." Dr. Ashworth's precise diction betrayed nothing, yet Lady Margaret detected beneath it a note of strain. "I understand Professor Blackthorne has already arrived. I confess curiosity about this discovery he's been hinting at in his correspondence." "He seems quite excited about his research," Lady Margaret replied, noting how Dr. Ashworth's composed features tightened almost imperceptibly. "Something about new biographical insights into the Scarlet letter, if I understood correctly." The effect upon Dr. Ashworth was subtle but unmistakable to one who knew her well. A brief shadow crossed her features, quickly suppressed, but not before Lady Margaret had observed it. The academic world, she reflected, possessed its own capacity for concealing deep currents beneath polished surfaces. The gradual arrival of additional guests filled the drawing room with scholarly atmosphere. The Reverend Canon Pemberton entered with his air of moral gravity, having been overheard that afternoon speaking in hushed tones about truths better left buried. Young James Whitmore appeared conspicuously agitated, clutching his research portfolio with nervous intensity, his gaze darting repeatedly toward the library where Professor Blackthorne held court. Miss Cordelia Thorne, the manor's scholarly librarian, moved with quiet efficiency among the assembled company, yet her usual serenity seemed touched by an uncharacteristic watchfulness. "One anticipates tomorrow's presentations with considerable interest," Canon Pemberton observed to Dr. Ashworth, his clerical collar seeming to press rather tightly around his neck. "Though one hopes that scholarly inquiry serves truth rather than sensation. Professor Blackthorne has never been accused of sensationalism," Dr. Ashworth replied carefully. "His methods are thorough, if sometimes comprehensive in their scope." Young Whitmore shifted uncomfortably at these words, his manuscript pages rustling in his nervous grip. The polite murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of teacups, and the soft rustle of silk formed a civilized veneer over an atmosphere that thrummed with unspoken rivalries and carefully suppressed apprehensions. As evening settled over Thornfield Manor, and the assembled company prepared to retire before the morrow's formal proceedings, the ancient house seemed to hold its breath. In the library, a small crimson bookmark lay forgotten between the pages of a rare manuscript, and Mrs. Hartwell, making her final rounds, paused to straighten a mirror that reflected more questions than answers. The symposium had not yet begun, but already the weight of revelation hung in the air like morning mist, promising to burn away more than scholarly uncertainty when the sun rose again. The library at Thornfield Manor greeted the morning with a dignity that did not rely upon sunlight. Its oak paneling absorbed the pale autumn day without complaint, while tall cases with their brass rails and rolling ladder seemed less to display than to uphold the volumes entrusted to them. A small coal fire moved discreetly behind its fender, lending the room a fragrance of beeswax and warmed leather that spoke of generations of scholarly discourse. On the central table, polished to a docile glow, a row of porcelain cups stood ready beside a silver pot, the service arranged by Graves with that exactness which suggested both long habit and the silent ritual of deference to learning. In the corner, Miss Cordelia Thorne lifted the blinds with measured precision and adjusted the angle of a reading lamp so that it would illuminate rather than interrogate the materials arranged beneath it. The company assembled with careful quiet that befitted the setting. Professor Edmund Blackthorne entered with the assurance of a man accustomed to the authority conferred by research, his notes fastened with red tape and his manner tempered by unusual animation. Dr. Helena Ashworth followed shortly after, her plain, well-cut suit and glazed gloves speaking to professional competence. She removed the gloves with precise economy, laying them upon the arm of a chair as if to demonstrate to the library that she came prepared for serious work. Lady Margaret, whose presence would dignify a humbler room, positioned herself near the fire, her smile easy but watchful. The Reverend Canon Pemberton, his clerical black giving him the appearance of ink drawn through a sentence, took up a position from which he might observe without appearing to do so. James Whitmore hovered at the threshold, until Miss Thorne, with a small nod that permitted rather than welcomed, directed him to a chair at the auxiliary table. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Blackthorne, and the slight roughness of his voice played to his advantage, suggesting a man who had talked more than he had slept. "I shall not anticipate my address this evening. Yet it would be disingenuous not to acknowledge that our subject, Hawthorne and the nature of inherited shame, has yielded a vein of evidence which, if corroborated, would place a certain English family in unexpected relation to that American narrative. Unexpected relations abound in literature," Canon Pemberton remarked, turning his cup with 2 fingers as if it contained confidence rather than tea. "Whether they serve edification is another matter entirely." Blackthorne's smile showed the merest suggestion of amusement. "Edification may be a consequence rather than an aim, Canon. Truth is frequently indifferent to our moral architecture." Dr. Ashworth's hand steadied the lid of the sugar bowl. "One hopes," she said, selecting a small cube and setting it deliberately in her tea, "that truth is not compelled into allegory by the pressure of expectation." Miss Thorne intervened with gentle firmness that owed nothing to diffidence. "Perhaps a brief survey of the Thornfield materials would be useful. The letter book you requested, Professor, is here. The Hawthorne correspondence there. The folio must be turned upon the cloth, not directly upon the wood. We've placed it upon a cradle. If you please, Mr. Whitmore, do refrain from resting your elbow." Under this domesticated ceremonial, the work began. Pages turned with soft haste. Pens were uncapped and poised. The whisper of tracing paper and occasional chink of silver tongs punctuated the silence. Blackthorne moved between volumes with almost theatrical economy, reading, comparing, and marking his place with narrow slips of cream card that seemed to multiply under his hand. He quoted dates and cross-referenced without ostentation. The effect upon his hearers was no less marked for being contained. Dr. Ashworth, who had been very pale upon entering, recovered some colour and applied herself to an index with concentration that, while admirable, had in it something defensive. It was Whitmore, in the end, who dislodged the quiet. Under Miss Thorne's unswerving eye, he turned a page of the letter-book. There was slight friction, as if something clung to the paper, and a small embroidered object slipped free and settled upon the green baize like a theatrical cue. It was a scarlet letter, not printed but wrought in thread, the stitches fine and minutely regular, the red deepened by age into the tone of an old rose petal. No one spoke at first. The fire altered its breath, and a clock on the mantel permitted itself a single advance. "Is that one of your bookmarks, Miss Thorne?" Blackthorne asked, almost softly. "It is not," she said, and her tone did not admit speculation. She took up the small thing in both hands, as one might take up a token in church. "This does not belong to the library." "May I?" He extended his hand. For half a heartbeat it appeared she would refuse. Lady Margaret, after a fractional pause that in another woman would have constituted alarm, inclined her head. Miss Thorne laid the scarlet letter upon the centre of the polished table where all might see without touching. "Such objects," the canon observed, "seldom arrive without intention. I hope we are not to be treated to a pageant of theatricals." "The theatre has its uses," Blackthorne murmured, "as for that matter do relics." He bent to examine the needlework. "English work, I think. Not American. Silk, perhaps. Old enough to have meaning. Not so old as to be beyond time's reach." Dr. Ashworth did not come nearer, but she watched with stillness that had in it no calm. "One might as well read it as a signature," she said. "An accusation, even. Surely, Professor, you cannot claim this as evidence." "I claim nothing. Yet." He straightened, and the interest that sharpened his expression did not take on the vulgarity of triumph. "But I observe." His gaze touched, without seeming to rest, upon the three women and the young man. One does not insert a letter into a letter-book without design. Whatever else it may be, it is contemporary. Miss Thorne produced a shallow tray lined with linen and, with librarian's reverence backed by hostess's authority, set the scarlet letter within it. "I shall lock it with the folios," she said. "If it is to be studied, it will be studied in this room, under my care." "Very right," Lady Margaret agreed, and the power in her assent momentarily removed the question from academic jurisdiction. "I must request, Professor, that nothing leaves the library without my knowledge." Blackthorne bowed, and in the bow there was faintest acknowledgment of boundaries tested and accepted, at least for the present. "You shall have it, Lady Margaret, and I shall have my keynote this evening. I promise nothing sensational, only, I hope, illumination." They resumed their work, if one could call it resumption. Conversation receded into the texture of rustling pages and the notation of references. Yet a new politeness had entered the room, as if each, while addressing the book before him, maintained a second and more careful address to the company. The day, which had seemed at the outset composed and ample, began to contract discreetly round the promise of the evening. In the corridor, Mrs. Hartwell passed and repassed, carrying the fragrance of furniture polish and warm bread from the kitchens, while hushed conferences developed in peripheral spaces. The canon spoke apart with Lady Margaret near the globe, turning a finger upon the Atlantic. Dr. Ashworth stood and read, then sat and read, then looked through the window at the clipped yews as if they had opinions worth consulting. Before luncheon, Miss Thorne lifted the tray and, with grave formality, placed the embroidered letter in the shallow drawer of the reading table, turning the key before placing it upon a chain at her waist. "We shall continue after 2, she said. "Professor, your lantern slides may be arranged then." When they had gone, the library stood momentarily empty, as if taking stock. A particle of red thread, too faint to have been seen until the sun fell just so, had adhered to the nap of the baize near the letterbook's edge. In the corridor, a floorboard gave its small complaint. The clock on the mantel chimed the half-hour, and the sound seemed to lay a thin, measured line across the morning, separating what had been from what must come. The evening at Thornfield Manor had settled into that particular quality of autumn quiet that seems to muffle even the most civilized of sounds. When the drawing-room conversations had concluded and the guests had dispersed to their various pursuits, the library, left in partial illumination by a single reading lamp, retained the day's scholarly atmosphere while acquiring something more intimate in the gathering shadows. Professor Blackthorne had excused himself from the after-dinner gathering with his customary courtesy, mentioning a desire to review his keynote materials in the alcove's privacy, where a comfortable chair and adequate light would serve his final preparations. The assembled company had accepted this scholarly eccentricity with the tolerance due to a man of his reputation, though several had noted the particular intensity with which he clutched his portfolio of research materials. Miss Cordelia Thorne, making her evening rounds with the methodical care that had preserved the library's treasures for 2 decades, discovered the alteration in the room's atmosphere before she perceived its cause. The quality of silence had changed, acquiring that absolute stillness that speaks not of rest, but of cessation. She approached the alcove with the measured step of one accustomed to respecting scholarly concentration, yet something in the unnatural position of the figure in the leather chair caused her to pause. Professor Blackthorne sat with his head fallen back against the chair's high back, his eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an expression of profound shock that death had frozen into permanence. His right hand lay open upon his chest, while his left remained clenched in a grip that rigor mortis had already begun to set. The discovery brought Lady Margaret with swift composure, followed by Graves, whose 4 decades of service had prepared him for most domestic crises, but not, perhaps, for violent death in a library alcove. Dr. Helena Ashworth appeared in the doorway with that particular stillness that marks those who have encountered mortality in academic rather than personal terms, while Canon Pemberton's clerical training asserted itself in a murmured prayer that seemed to encompass both the deceased and the living. Young Whitmore, who had been returning to retrieve a forgotten notebook, stood frozen at the threshold until Graves' gentle guidance moved him aside for the local physician, Dr. Hartwell, whose arrival had been secured with commendable efficiency. The medical examination, conducted with the discretion appropriate to the social circumstances, revealed details that transformed scholarly tragedy into criminal matter. Dr. Hartwell's initial assumption of natural causes, perhaps cardiac failure brought on by intellectual excitement, gave way to more troubling observations. The deceased's color, the particular set of his features, and certain other signs suggested circumstances inconsistent with natural death. More disturbing still was the object clutched in Professor Blackthorne's rigid left hand. An embroidered scarlet letter identical to that morning's discovery, save for the dark stains that marked its delicate silk threads. The letter had been grasped with such force that small puncture wounds on the palm had bled as if the dying man had pressed the symbol against his flesh in some final, desperate gesture. "I fear," Dr. Hartwell said quietly to Lady Margaret, his professional manner tempering the gravity of his words, "that we must consider this matter beyond natural explanation. The circumstances suggest—" He paused, his gaze encompassing the assembled company with careful neutrality. "I shall be obliged to contact the authorities." The professor's scattered research materials, when gathered with appropriate care, revealed the scope of his controversial investigations. Genealogical charts traced certain English families through Victorian scandal, while correspondence with various archives suggested months of systematic inquiry into matters of illegitimate birth and inherited shame. Marginal notes in Blackthorne's precise handwriting indicated his belief that he had uncovered the real-life inspiration for Hawthorne's fictional narrative, with implications that would have caused considerable distress to living descendants. Dr. Ashworth, observing these materials with scholarly detachment that seemed to require considerable effort, remarked that such research often uncovered truths that families preferred to keep buried. The local constabulary, represented by Sergeant Davies, arrived with the solid competence of rural law enforcement, yet his examination of the scene clearly revealed circumstances beyond his usual jurisdiction. The social prominence of those involved, combined with the suspicious nature of the death and the symbolic significance of the evidence, required investigation by officers trained in such delicate matters. His telephone call to Scotland Yard was made with the recognition that Thornfield Manor's tragedy demanded more sophisticated attention than the local force could provide. As the household settled into the uneasy quiet that follows violent death, each member of the company seemed to wrestle with private concerns that extended beyond mere shock at the professor's demise. Lady Margaret's distress appeared to encompass more than hostess anxiety, while Dr. Ashworth's scholarly composure showed signs of strain that suggested personal as well as professional interest in the evening's events. The library, sealed pending official examination, retained its atmosphere of interrupted scholarship, while the Scarlet letter, now secured as evidence, had fulfilled its symbolic purpose with a completeness that would have satisfied even Hawthorne's sense of moral irony. In the drawing room, where the surviving members of the symposium maintained the forms of civilized discourse, the weight of hidden truths pressed upon the elegant facade of academic society, promising revelations that would prove far more disturbing than any scholarly discovery. The night settled over Thornfield Manor with a heaviness that seemed to compress the very air, while in the sealed library, a small grain of crystalline substance caught the lamplight near the alcove, unnoticed by all, save the shadows that would keep their counsel until morning brought more experienced eyes to read the signs that death had left behind. The morning after tragedy had visited Thornfield Manor brought with it a quality of light that seemed to examine rather than illuminate, filtering through windows that had witnessed the previous evening's events, with the impartial clarity that daylight brings to matters best conducted in shadow. The great house had settled into that particular stillness which follows violent death, not the comfortable quiet of scholarly routine, but a weighted silence that spoke of disrupted order and carefully guarded secrets. Inspector Roderick Alleyn stepped from the police motor with the measured grace that marked his approach to scenes of violence, neither hurried nor hesitant, but possessed of that patient authority, which understood that death, however sudden, required methodical attention from the living. Sergeant Fox, whose solid presence provided reassuring counterpoint to his superior's more cultivated manner, followed with the leather case that contained the instruments of their profession. Lady Margaret received them in the morning room, where autumn sunlight fell across Persian carpets with democratic impartiality. Her composure, while admirable, bore the particular strain of one who had spent the night wrestling with implications that extended beyond immediate tragedy. She wore black, not yet formal mourning, but a dress that acknowledged death's gravity without surrendering to theatrical gesture. "Inspector Alleyn, I am grateful for your prompt attention to this dreadful matter," she said, her voice carrying the trained modulation of one accustomed to addressing difficult subjects with appropriate gravity. "Professor Blackthorne was a guest in my house. I feel the responsibility most keenly." Alleyn accepted the offered chair with courtesy due his hostess, yet his grey eyes had already begun their systematic examination of the room's details, the placement of furniture, the quality of light, the small signs that spoke to household routine disrupted by extraordinary circumstance. "Lady Margaret, may I express my sympathy for these distressing events? I understand Professor Blackthorne was conducting research of some delicacy." The library, when examined in company with Fox and Miss Cordelia Thorne, revealed its secrets with the reluctance characteristic of scenes where violence had intruded upon scholarly peace. The alcove retained the impression of interrupted work, papers scattered with disorder that spoke of sudden disturbance rather than methodical research. Alleyn moved through the space with that maddening deliberation which attended first to atmosphere and arrangement. The angle of the chair, the darkened spine of a recently handled volume, the faint ring upon the small table where something other than a tumbler had briefly rested. "The embroidered letter, Miss Thorne," he said, examining the evidence with gloved fingers. "Remarkable needlework. English work, I should say, and not recent. This has been preserved with considerable care over many years." Miss Thorne's response carried the measured precision of professional librarian. "It appeared yesterday morning between the pages of the Hawthorne correspondence. I secured it immediately in the reading table drawer. The key has not left my possession." She indicated the chain at her waist with quiet authority. Fox, whose practical mind complemented his superior's more theoretical approach, knelt beside the alcove chair with surprising grace for so large a man. "You'll see here, sir," he said, pointing without touching to a pale crystalline grain that caught the light. "And this mark on the chair arm, damp hand, perhaps. The carpet shows a thread, red, very faint." Alleyn bent to examine. These details, hands clasped behind his back in characteristic pose. The small evidences spoke their silent testimony. The crystal that suggested chemical means, the thread that connected to yesterday's discovery, the ring mark that implied a vessel other than those provided by household service. Someone, he observed quietly, possessed both knowledge and opportunity to administer something with considerable precision. Graves appeared with that discretion marking 4 decades of devoted service, his silver head inclined in practiced deference. "Inspector, if I may be of assistance." Professor Blackthorne was a gentleman of regular habits, always particular about his tea, never late for dinner, though he seemed rather preoccupied these recent days, more so than usual for scholarly excitement. "And the evening's arrangements?" Alleyn inquired with gentle authority. "Dinner concluded at 9:30, sir. Coffee in the drawing-room." The professor excused himself to review his materials. "I made my rounds of the lamps at 9:30. Miss Thorne discovered the alteration at 9:40. Dr. Helena Ashworth, when questioned in the drawing-room, maintained scholarly composure that nonetheless exhibited subtle signs of strain. Her hands remained precisely clasped, her gaze direct, yet Alleyn detected the particular care with which she chose her words. "Professor Blackthorne's research was sometimes provocatively speculative," she began. "His theories regarding real-life antecedents of literary figures could be rather audacious. His latest discovery," Alleyn continued conversationally. "This remarkable turn he mentioned. What did you make of that?" A momentary hesitation betrayed deeper currents. He spoke of inherited shame, of family scandal brought to light. One imagines it would have been quite sensational, had he lived to present it. Her adjustment of spectacles seemed almost imperceptible, yet spoke to carefully controlled disquiet. As the morning progressed, Alleyn found himself increasingly aware of undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of scholarly discourse and social propriety. The embroidered scarlet letter functioned as more than mere evidence. It carried symbolic weight that resonated through the household, with implications extending beyond immediate significance as clue to murder. Each member of the company displayed signs of strain, yet the particular nature suggested secrets predating the professor's death by considerable time. The afternoon brought confirmation when the local physician identified the crystalline residue as plant-based poison of unusual potency. The discovery transformed investigation from suspicious death to deliberate murder, executed with knowledge and premeditation that spoke to careful planning rather than sudden passion. Alleyn, examining the evidence with Fox's methodical assistance, reflected upon the psychology required for such method, one suggesting both scientific knowledge and desire to avoid direct confrontation. "The scarlet letter, Fox," he observed as they concluded their examination, "was not merely symbolic. It was a signature. someone's final comment upon Professor Blackthorn's research. His gaze moved thoughtfully across the library's ordered shelves, where volumes of literature and history maintained silent witness to human folly and ambition. Someone in this house possessed the means, the knowledge, and the desperate motive to transform scholarly inquiry into criminal act. The evening found the inspector in contemplation of a case promising to reveal as much about the living as the dead. While somewhere in Thornfield Manor's elegant rooms, a mind capable of murder wrestled with the knowledge that truth, however carefully buried, possessed an uncomfortable tendency toward resurrection. The small study adjacent to Thornfield's library had acquired, through necessity, the methodical atmosphere of a police headquarters, though the mahogany paneling and leather-bound volumes maintained their dignity despite the intrusion of official business. Rain drew fine patterns across the mullioned windows, creating a curtain of grey that seemed to isolate the manor from the outside world, leaving its occupants to wrestle with secrets that had festered in darkness for generations. Inspector Alleyn sat at the cleared desk with Professor Blackthorn's research materials arranged before him in careful order. Genealogical charts weighted with crystal paperweights, photographic copies of Victorian correspondence, and a leather portfolio that spoke to months of systematic inquiry into matters certain families had preferred to keep buried. The scope of the professor's investigation became apparent as Alleyn examined each document with the careful attention he reserved for evidence that promised to illuminate motive as well as method. Fox, whose practical mind complemented his superior's more theoretical approach, had arranged the materials with characteristic precision, creating a visual map of scandal that stretched across several prominent English families. One name appeared with disturbing frequency throughout the Victorian records. Variations of Ashworth, Pembroke, and Thorne, all connected by threads of illegitimate birth, social disgrace, and carefully concealed shame. "Most thorough, our professor," Alleyn observed, his finger tracing connections that Blackthorn had mapped with scholarly precision. He appears to have been less interested in literary theory than in the specific genealogical underpinnings of Hawthorne's narrative. This suggests research of a rather more personal nature than one might expect from purely academic inquiry. Miss Cordelia Thorne entered at Alleyn's request, her composure intact, yet marked by a watchfulness that spoke to private tensions within the household. Her hands, usually steady in their precise movements, showed the slightest tremor as she arranged herself in the offered chair. When she spoke, her voice carried the measured precision of one who had spent decades protecting family secrets from scholarly scrutiny. "Inspector, I must confess that Professor Blackthorn's research had uncovered materials that I had believed safely preserved from public examination," she began, her gaze fixed upon a point slightly beyond Alleyn's shoulder. "Certain documents, deemed to be of a particularly delicate family nature, have traditionally been kept in a separate collection. It is a matter of preserving privacy, you understand." Alleyn's response carried no censure, only gentle inquiry. These materials corroborated the professor's theories. "They documented certain unfortunate historical events," she replied carefully. "A daughter of the Thornfield line in the 1840s who suffered public disgrace, an illegitimate child, a subsequent disappearance from society." She paused, then added with obvious reluctance. Professor Blackthorn was remarkably thorough in his methods. He had discovered not only the family connection, but also the ecclesiastical records that would have confirmed his theory. The revelation took on greater significance when Alleyn examined the parish register that Miss Thorne produced from the library's secure collection. The leather binding showed signs of recent disturbance, and a careful examination revealed that a page from the early 1860s had been cleanly removed, leaving only stubs that bore traces of glue residue where something had once been pasted over the original entry. "This alteration was recent?" Alleyn inquired, noting Fox's careful documentation of the evidence. "I discovered it only yesterday evening, when securing the library after the professor's death," Miss Thorne admitted. "The page contained baptismal records from the period in question, Its removal would have eliminated crucial evidence supporting Professor Blackthorn's research. Dr. Helena Ashworth, when questioned in the drawing room's formal atmosphere, maintained her scholarly composure while exhibiting subtle signs of strain that suggested personal investment in the investigation's outcome. Her response to Alleyn's inquiries about her family history carried the careful modulation of one who had rehearsed difficult admissions in private moments. My academic work has focused on Victorian social issues as reflected in literature, she said, her hands precisely clasped in her lap. However, Professor Blackthorn's research had uncovered connections between my own family history and the scandal he was investigating. My great-grandmother, it appears, was among those whose disgrace inspired Hawthorne's fictional narrative. The admission, while delivered with academic detachment, carried implications that extended far beyond scholarly interest. Alleyn recognized the particular desperation that attends the preservation of professional reputation when built upon foundations that cannot bear scrutiny. Young James Whitmore's interview revealed another dimension to the professor's research that cast the evening's events in increasingly complex light. His own genealogical investigations, conducted for doctoral research, had inadvertently provided corroborating evidence that Blackthorne had used to support his theory. The connection between their work had been established through correspondence that Whitmore now regarded with obvious distress. "I never intended to provide evidence for his theories," Whitmore said, his youthful features marked by genuine anguish. "My work on Victorian family structures was purely academic. When Professor Blackthorne contacted me about certain parish records I had uncovered, I shared my findings without understanding their implications for living persons." The Reverend Canon Pemberton's involvement became clear when Alleyn discovered correspondence indicating that the canon's family had held ecclesiastical positions during the period of the original scandal. His moral distress, evident throughout the investigation, took on new meaning when viewed in the context of family records that would have confirmed the professor's most damaging theories. "The weight of inherited sin, Inspector," the canon said when questioned about his family's connection to the historical events. "My grandfather served the parish during the period in question. Our family maintained certain duplicate records that Professor Blackthorne believed would provide final confirmation of his theory." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the study's Persian carpet, Alleyn found himself contemplating evidence that pointed not to simple murder, but to a conspiracy of silence that had been maintained across generations. The Victorian scandal that had inspired Hawthorne's fictional narrative had reached across time to claim a contemporary victim, demonstrating that shame, however carefully buried, possessed an uncomfortable tendency toward resurrection. "Fox," he said as they concluded the day's interviews, "we are dealing with a murder, rooted in the peculiar desperation that attends the preservation of reputation." Professor Blackthorne's research threatened not merely historical accuracy, but contemporary lives built upon carefully maintained deceptions. The embroidered scarlet letter, secured as evidence yet symbolically omnipresent, had served as both catalyst and signature. The killer's attempt to mark their victim with the same shame that had haunted their own family for generations. As evening settled over Thornfield Manor, the weight of hidden truths pressed upon the elegant facade of scholarly civility, promising revelations that would prove far more disturbing than any academic discovery. In the sealed library, where the professor's research materials lay arranged like pieces of an intricate puzzle, the past and present had converged with deadly consequence, leaving Inspector Alleyn to unravel not merely the method of murder, but the complex web of inherited shame that had made it seem, to someone in that house, the only possible solution to an impossible situation. The still room at Thornfield Manor lay half a level below the main kitchens, occupying that particular domestic territory where the household's more delicate economies were conducted with quiet efficiency. Cool stone flags retained the night's chill, while rows of labeled glass bottles caught the pale morning light that filtered through a small, grated window set high in the wall. Here, The gentle fragrances of lavender and dried rose petals mingled with the sharper notes of medicinal herbs, creating an atmosphere that spoke to generations of careful housekeeping and family remedies. Inspector Alleyn paused upon the threshold, acknowledging the intimate privacy that clung to such spaces, before stepping forward with Sergeant Fox at his shoulder to examine what had become, through necessity, a crucial piece of evidence in their investigation. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper whose discretion had protected family secrets for 3 decades, stood with composed dignity beside the herb cupboard, her hands folded before her starched apron. Her weathered features bore the strain of recent events, yet she maintained that particular authority which marked those who had earned their position through devoted service rather than mere employment. When Alleyn inquired about access to the still room's contents, her response carried the measured precision of one accustomed to accounting for household matters with absolute accuracy. 28 years I've kept this room, Inspector, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Lady Margaret's mother taught me the old receipts, simple preparations for nerves and sleeplessness, nothing more elaborate than what any country house might require. She indicated the neat rows of labeled bottles with obvious pride. We've maintained the traditional remedies, though I confess some of the older preparations require ingredients that are less commonly used in modern households. Fox's methodical examination of the cupboard revealed the systematic organization that marked professional competence, yet his trained eye detected subtle signs of recent disturbance. A small unmarked bottle in the shallow drawer bore traces of crystalline residue that caught the light with particular significance. The absence of a label, in a collection otherwise marked with meticulous care, suggested either oversight or deliberate concealment. When subjected to preliminary examination, the residue exhibited properties consistent with the botanical compound that had claimed Professor Blackthorn's life. The preparation of such substances, Alleyn observed to Mrs. Hartwell, would require considerable knowledge of botanical chemistry. This is not merely a matter of steeping herbs for tisans, but of extracting specific alkaloids with precision that suggests scientific training. Her response revealed the household tensions that had preceded the professor's death. Dr. Ashworth had expressed interest in our traditional remedies, Inspector. She mentioned her academic work on Victorian medicinal practices and asked particularly about the older preparations. I showed her the receipt book. It seemed a harmless scholarly interest at the time. The conservatory, with its atmosphere of carefully cultivated beauty, provided the setting for Alleyn's most crucial interview of the investigation. Dr. Helena Ashworth entered with the measured composure that had carried her through decades of academic advancement, yet the morning light revealed the fine lines around her eyes that spoke to sleepless nights and the weight of secrets maintained across years of professional success. She paused among the orchids, her gloved fingers touching a bloom with absent precision before taking the chair Alleyn indicated with courteous gesture. Dr. Ashworth, Alleyn began with gentle formality, I believe we must speak frankly about Professor Blackthorn's research and its implications for your family history. His notes suggest discoveries that extended far beyond literary theory into matters of genealogical fact that would have profound consequences for your professional standing. Her response carried the careful modulation of one who had rehearsed difficult admissions in private moments. Inspector, my academic career has been built upon the study of Victorian social issues as they appear in literature. However, I must acknowledge that Professor Blackthorn had uncovered connections between my own family and the historical scandal that inspired Hawthorne's narrative. She paused, her gaze fixed upon the garden beyond the glass walls. My great-grandmother was the woman whose disgrace provided the real-life foundation for the Scarlet Letter. This connection, if revealed publicly, would have destroyed not merely my scholarly reputation, but my entire professional identity. The systematic nature of Professor Blackthorn's research became clearer as Alleyn examined the correspondence and documentation that Fox had arranged with characteristic precision. The professor had been methodically gathering evidence from multiple sources, church records, private letters, genealogical societies, to build an irrefutable case for his theory. His marginal notes revealed growing excitement at the prospect of presenting findings that would revolutionize understanding of American literary history, while simultaneously destroying the carefully constructed life of a respected colleague. The method employed against Professor Blackthorne, Alleyn continued, required not merely access to rare botanical compounds, but the specialized knowledge necessary to extract and administer them with lethal precision. Your doctoral research included extensive study of Victorian medicinal practices, while your current position at Cambridge provides access to research facilities that would make such substances available to someone with appropriate credentials. Dr. Ashworth's composure showed the first signs of strain as she acknowledged the accuracy of his observations. The irony was not lost on me, Inspector, that I had spent years analyzing the very societal disgrace that was intimately connected to my own lineage. To have devoted my career to the dispassionate study of shame and social ostracism, only to discover that my own family was the source of the scandal I had examined from supposedly objective distance. It was an unbearable situation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the conservatory's tiled floor, Alleyn found himself contemplating evidence that pointed not merely to murder, but to the peculiar desperation that attends the preservation of reputation when built upon foundations that cannot bear scrutiny. The embroidered scarlet letter, examined under magnification, had revealed traces of the same botanical compound that killed the professor, evidence suggesting that the killer had handled both poison and symbolic marker with the same gloved hands. The scarlet letter was not merely evidence, Alleyn observed, but a psychological necessity. Someone in this house felt compelled to mark Professor Blackthorne with the same shame that had haunted their family for generations. It was an attempt to transfer inherited guilt, to make the accuser bear the burden of historical disgrace. Young James Whitmore's unwitting contribution to the tragedy became apparent when Alleyn discovered correspondence revealing that his genealogical research had provided crucial corroborating evidence for Blackthorne's theory. The professor had contacted him months earlier, requesting access to parish records that Whitmore had uncovered during his doctoral studies. The young man's growing distress throughout the symposium took on new significance when viewed in the context of his inadvertent role in research that threatened to destroy a respected colleague's career. "I never understood the personal implications," Whitmore said, his youthful features marked by genuine anguish. "When Professor Blackthorne requested copies of certain baptismal records, I provided them as a matter of scholarly courtesy. Only later did I realize how he intended to use this evidence." As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of final revelation, Alleyn reflected upon a case that demonstrated the tragic consequences of inherited shame, and the lengths to which respectable persons might go to preserve carefully maintained deceptions. The murder of Professor Blackthorne represented not sudden passion, but calculated elimination of a threat to an entire professional identity built upon concealment of family disgrace. "Fox," he said as they concluded their examination, "we are dealing with a mind capable of remarkable calculation. The killer understood not merely how to eliminate Professor Blackthorne, but how to mark him with the same shame that had haunted their own family for generations. It was murderous, both practical necessity and symbolic gesture, a desperate attempt to silence truth while transferring the burden of historical guilt. The conservatory, with its atmosphere of cultivated beauty concealing the harsh realities of survival and decay, seemed an appropriate setting for contemplating a crime rooted in the preservation of appearances. As the last light faded from the glass walls, Inspector Alleyn prepared for the final confrontation that would expose not merely a killer, but the complex web of inherited sin that had made murder seem, to someone in that house, the only possible solution to an impossible situation. The drawing room at Thornfield Manor had acquired, through the subtle rearrangement of furniture and the strategic positioning of lamps, the atmosphere of a stage prepared for performance rather than casual discourse. Inspector Alleyn had requested the presence of the surviving symposium members for what he termed a clarification of certain matters, though the gravity in his manner suggested conclusions rather than mere inquiries. The autumn evening pressed against the mullioned windows with unusual weight, while within the coal fire cast shadows that seemed to dance with secrets long concealed. Lady Margaret occupied her customary chair near the hearth, her aristocratic composure intact, yet marked by the particular tension that attends the approach of unwelcome revelations. The familiar ritual of after-dinner gathering had been transformed into something more theatrical, more charged with unspoken significance. Dr. Helena Ashworth entered with the measured precision that had characterized her throughout the investigation, yet Alleyn's trained eye detected subtle alterations in her bearing. The careful placement of her hands, the deliberate control of her breathing, the way her gaze avoided certain objects in the room. Miss Cordelia Thorne followed with quiet dignity, her role as keeper of family secrets lending her movements particular gravity, while the Reverend Canon Pemberton positioned himself near the globe with ecclesiastical authority that seemed to encompass both moral judgment and protective discretion. Young James Whitmore hovered at the threshold with the hesitant manner of one who sensed approaching catastrophe without comprehending its precise nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began with courteous formality, "our investigation has revealed a crime of unusual complexity, one rooted not in sudden passion, but in the peculiar desperation that attends the preservation of reputation when built upon foundations that cannot bear scrutiny. Professor Blackthorne's research threatened more than scholarly theory. It promised to expose truths that would have destroyed carefully constructed lives. Sergeant Fox, whose methodical nature provided perfect counterpoint to his superior's more theoretical approach, had arranged the evidence upon the mahogany side table with characteristic precision. The embroidered, scarlet letter lay beneath protective glass, its silk threads catching the lamplight with symbolic significance that had acquired, through violent circumstance, meaning far beyond its original intent. Beside it, Professor Blackthorne's research materials spread across the polished surface like pieces of an intricate puzzle, while the small unmarked bottle from the still room stood as silent testament to scientific knowledge employed for deadly purpose. The method employed against Professor Blackthorne required intimate knowledge of botanical chemistry. Alleyn continued, his gaze encompassing the assembled company with gentle authority. The compound used, a rare alkaloid extracted with considerable skill, mimics cardiac failure while leaving traces detectable only through sophisticated analysis. Such expertise suggests academic training combined with access to research facilities that would make such substances available to someone with appropriate credentials. The canon cleared his throat with clerical gravity. "Inspector, you speak of knowledge that is surely not common among persons of ordinary education. This suggests premeditation of the most calculated sort." "Indeed, Canon. The killer possessed not merely means and opportunity, but also intimate familiarity with the manor's domestic rhythms and the habits of its occupants. This was not a crime of sudden impulse, but a meticulously planned act executed within the very confines of social propriety." Alleyn moved to the coffee service, still arranged upon its silver tray. The evening social hour provided perfect cover, guests circulating freely between drawing room and library, conversations flowing with scholarly ease, the gentle ritual of hospitality masking more sinister purpose. Dr. Ashworth's response carried measured precision, yet Alleyn detected the effort required to maintain such composure. "You suggest, Inspector, that someone among us possessed both the technical knowledge and the moral flexibility to commit such an act. While I acknowledge the accuracy of your observations regarding method, I must point out that academic circles often share similar expertise." "Quite so, Dr. Ashworth. Yet the Scarlet letter presents particular significance that extends beyond mere technical consideration." Alleyn lifted the evidence with gloved fingers, allowing the lamplight to illuminate its intricate needlework. Analysis has revealed traces of the same botanical compound that killed Professor Blackthorne, suggesting that both poison and symbol were handled by the same person. This was not merely evidence left for investigators, but a psychological necessity, the killer's attempt to mark their victim with the same shame that had haunted their own family for generations. The revelation settled upon the room with the weight of moral judgment long deferred. Miss Thorne's quiet admission provided crucial context. "I must confess, Inspector, that I facilitated access to certain family documents that corroborated Professor Blackthorne's research. Several members of our company had expressed scholarly interest in our historical materials." Young Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, his manuscript pages rustling with nervous energy. "I shared genealogical research with Professor Blackthorne months ago, purely as academic courtesy. Only later did I understand how he intended to use such evidence." "The irony was profound," Alleyn observed with gentle understanding. "Someone in this room had devoted years to the objective study of inherited sin, only to discover they were analyzing the very scandal that marked their own lineage. The prospect of public revelation, of having scholarly objectivity exposed as elaborate concealment, would have proven unbearable to someone whose entire professional identity depended upon maintaining such deception." The atmosphere in the drawing room grew increasingly charged as Allen's words found their mark among the assembled company. Lady Margaret's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her chair's arm, while Dr. Ashworth maintained scholarly composure that seemed to require considerable effort. The embroidered scarlet letter, no longer mere evidence but symbol of inherited shame, transformed into contemporary tragedy, seemed to pulse with significance that extended beyond immediate criminal matter into the realm of moral complexity. The murder of Professor Blackthorne represented both practical elimination of threat and symbolic gesture of transference. Alleyn continued with quiet authority. Someone felt compelled to mark their victim with the same shame that had haunted their family for generations. A desperate attempt to silence truth while shifting the burden of historical guilt. As the inspector concluded his demonstration, the weight of revealed truth settled upon the elegant drawing room with the finality of judgment long deferred. The method had been exposed, the motive illuminated, yet the final revelation remained suspended in the charged atmosphere between accusation and confession. Outside Thornfield Manor's ancient walls, the autumn night pressed closer with the promise of confrontation that would strip away the last vestiges of scholarly respectability, while within, the moment approached when masks would finally be removed, and truth, however painful, would claim its inevitable victory over the most carefully constructed deceptions. The silence that followed carried the weight of secrets about to be surrendered, while somewhere in the manor's elegant rooms, a mind capable of murder prepared for the final act of a drama that had begun with inherited shame and would conclude with contemporary justice. The rose garden at Thornfield Manor lay in autumn's quiet benediction, where the geometry of clipped hedges and gravelled paths created a stage both intimate and dignified. Bare canes, pruned to their essential forms, stood like silent witnesses against walls of weathered brick, while fallen leaves gathered in drifts that whispered beneath careful footsteps with the sound of secrets finally surrendered. The air carried that particular fragrance of earth, preparing for winter's rest, mingled with the lingering perfume of late chrysanthemums and the clean scent of approaching rain. Inspector Alleyn had chosen this setting with deliberate consideration, understanding that truth often emerged more readily in spaces removed from the formal constraints of drawing rooms where the natural world provided both privacy and a certain moral gravity appropriate to final revelations. Dr. Helena Ashworth approached along the gravel path with measured steps that spoke to composure, maintained through supreme effort of will. Her tweed coat, buttoned against the afternoon chill, could not entirely conceal the slight tremor in her gloved hands, while her usually precise bearing showed signs of strain that years of academic discipline could no longer suppress. Sergeant Fox, with characteristic discretion, had positioned himself near the garden's eastern boundary, his substantial presence both protective and unobtrusive, while from the morning room's long windows, Lady Margaret's figure appeared briefly before withdrawing with the intuitive understanding that dignity required solitude for what must follow. "Dr. Ashworth," Alleyn said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had marked their investigation from its beginning, "I chose the garden because it offers both privacy and a certain honesty that formal rooms sometimes lack. We have arrived, I believe, at the point where continued dissimulation would serve neither justice nor mercy." She paused beside an espaliered pear, whose last leaves clung with autumnal determination, her fingers touching the weathered brick wall as if seeking support from something more permanent than human constructions. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful modulation of one who had rehearsed this moment through sleepless hours. Yet underneath lay the unmistakable note of relief that comes with the prospect of surrendering an unbearable burden. "Inspector, you have been scrupulously courteous throughout this dreadful business," she began, her gaze moving from the garden's ordered beauty to meet his grey eyes directly. "I will not abuse that courtesy with further evasion. Professor Blackthorne's death was neither natural nor the work of some unknown intruder. It was my doing, executed with the knowledge my academic training provided and the desperation that months of growing threat had created." Alleyn received this admission with the compassionate gravity that marked his approach to human frailty, understanding that confession represented both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one carefully constructed life and the commencement of whatever consequences truth might demand. "The method was learned, the occasion chosen with precision," he observed quietly. "The botanical compound extracted with considerable skill, administered during the evening's social confusion when academic courtesy masked more sinister purpose." Her response revealed the systematic nature of a crime that had been months in preparation. "My great-grandmother was the woman whose disgrace provided the foundation for Hawthorne's narrative, Inspector. The illegitimate child, the public humiliation, the subsequent disappearance from respectable society, all documented in parish records and family correspondence that I had spent my career analyzing from supposedly objective distance." She moved along the path with slow deliberation, her academic training asserting itself even in confession. The irony was unbearable. I had devoted decades to the dispassionate study of inherited sin, only to discover that my entire professional identity was built upon concealment of the very scandal I had examined with scholarly detachment. The garden's atmosphere of natural cycles and seasonal change seemed to encompass the human drama unfolding within its boundaries, as Dr. Ashworth described the growing desperation that had preceded Professor Blackthorne's death. His correspondence had grown increasingly confident, his research more thorough, his inevitable revelation more threatening to the carefully constructed life she had built upon foundations that could not bear scrutiny. "The compound was extracted in my laboratory at Cambridge," she continued with clinical precision that spoke to scientific training employed for deadly purpose. The Victorian medicinal practices I had studied for academic purposes provided the knowledge necessary to create a substance that would mimic cardiac failure. I prepared it in an unmarked bottle and brought it to Thornfield with the Scarlet letter, my great-grandmother's letter, Inspector, hidden in our family for generations as tangible reminder of shame that could never be fully erased. Alleyn's understanding of criminal psychology allowed him to perceive the profound desperation that had driven someone of Dr. Ashworth's caliber to such extreme measures. "The administration required both opportunity and nerve," he observed. "The evening's social hour, when guests moved freely between drawing room and library, when academic discourse masked more calculated purpose. Professor Blackthorne habitually took his coffee to the library for evening review of his materials," she replied, her voice growing quieter as the full weight of her actions settled upon the autumn air. During the confusion of after-dinner conversation, when Lady Margaret was engaged with Canon Pemberton and Graves attended to the service, It was not difficult to alter one cup for another. The compound acted slowly enough to allow him to reach his preferred alcove, yet with sufficient certainty to ensure the outcome I required. The Scarlet letter's role in the crime took on its full symbolic significance as Dr. Ashworth described the psychological necessity that had driven her to place it in the dying professor's hand. It was not merely evidence, Inspector, but a transfer of burden. For generations, that letter had marked my family with inherited shame. When I placed it with Professor Blackthorne, I was attempting to shift the weight of historical guilt, to make the accuser bear the disgrace he sought to expose. As the afternoon light began to fade across the garden's ordered beauty, Dr. Ashworth's confession reached its conclusion with the weary relief of one who had finally surrendered the exhausting effort of maintaining elaborate deception. I had spent my career analyzing the destructive power of inherited sin without understanding that I was not merely its student, but its victim. The attempt to escape family shame through scholarly achievement only delayed the inevitable reckoning that has now claimed both Professor Blackthorne and myself. Alleyn's response carried the compassionate understanding that marked his finest moments as both detective and student of human nature. The most tragic aspect, Dr. Ashworth, is that the shame you sought to conceal has ultimately created a far greater disgrace than any historical scandal could have produced. The Scarlet letter you tried to transfer to Professor Blackthorne has returned to mark you with consequences far more severe than academic embarrassment. As they walked back toward the manor's ancient walls, where Sergeant Fox waited with the formal documents that would conclude their investigation, the weight of truth finally revealed seemed to settle upon the autumn landscape with the finality of judgment long deferred. The rose garden, stripped of summer's concealment, bore witness to human frailty that had transformed scholarly respectability into criminal desperation, while the embroidered scarlet letter, secured as evidence of both historical shame and contemporary crime, had fulfilled its symbolic purpose with a completeness that would have satisfied even Hawthorne's sense of moral irony. In the gathering dusk, as Inspector Alleyn escorted his prisoner toward the waiting police motor, a small thread of red silk, caught upon a thorn and trembling in the evening breeze, provided the final, silent commentary upon a case where the sins of one generation had reached across time to claim contemporary victims, demonstrating the truth, however carefully buried, possessed an uncomfortable tendency toward resurrection. The library at Thornfield Manor wore a discreet air of fatigue in the pale November light, as if the polished surfaces and leather-bound volumes had endured a performance of considerable intensity and now, with the curtain fallen, bent themselves to the quieter business of restoration. The alcove where Professor Blackthorne had met his end stood empty, its leather chair positioned at respectful distance from the reading table, while the Persian carpet, freshly brushed, showed no mark of the tragedy that had unfolded upon its ancient patterns. A faint fragrance of beeswax and lavender clung to the oak paneling, speaking to Mrs. Hartwell's determined efforts to restore domestic order, yet beneath the surface, propriety lay an atmosphere of profound alteration that no amount of careful housekeeping could entirely dispel. Lady Margaret entered with the measured grace that had sustained her through recent trials, her black mourning dress lending appropriate gravity to the occasion, while her composed bearing spoke to aristocratic training in the management of a family crisis. She settled into her customary chair near the fireplace with authority that was undertaken rather than exercised, her gaze moving thoughtfully across the room where scholarly discourse had been transformed into criminal revelation. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular weariness of one who had witnessed the exposure of secrets maintained across generations. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, accepting the tea service that Graves arranged with his customary precision. "One spends a lifetime maintaining certain standards, preserving what one believes to be family honor. Then circumstances arise that reveal how such preservation can become its own form of tragedy." Her words carried no self-pity, only the quiet recognition of moral complexity that defied simple judgment. Alleyn received her observation with the compassionate understanding that marked his finest moments as both detective and student of human nature. The desire to protect family reputation is neither unusual nor entirely misguided, Lady Margaret. The tragedy lies in the recognition that secrets, however carefully maintained, possess an uncomfortable tendency toward resurrection. Dr. Ashworth's crime was rooted in the peculiar desperation that attends the preservation of professional identity when built upon foundations that cannot bear scrutiny. Miss Cordelia Thorne appeared with quiet authority, carrying the leather-bound volume that contained the Thornfield family records. Her role as keeper of family secrets had acquired new significance in the aftermath of revelations that had transformed private shame into criminal consequence. She placed the register upon the reading table with ceremonial precision that suggested both ending and beginning, the conclusion of concealment and the commencement of whatever honesty the future might require. "The historical documents will be properly archived with the British Museum," she said, her voice carrying the measured precision of professional responsibility. Professor Blackthorne's research, while tragically interrupted, contained valuable insights that deserve preservation without causing further personal distress. The Reverend Canon Pemberton's final visit was conducted with ecclesiastical gravity appropriate to circumstances involving both crime and moral complexity. His family's historical connection to the original scandal had placed him in the uncomfortable position of possessing knowledge that might have prevented tragedy, yet his clerical discretion had prevented him from sharing information he had considered privileged. "The persistence of sin across generations, Inspector," he observed with troubled dignity, "demonstrates how the past continues to shape the present in ways we cannot always anticipate or control." Young James Whitmore's departure had been marked by genuine distress at his unwitting contribution to the tragedy. His genealogical research, shared with Professor Blackthorne as scholarly courtesy, had provided crucial evidence for theories that would ultimately prove fatal. The young man's chastened understanding of academic responsibility spoke to innocence forever altered by contact with human complexity beyond his previous experience. As Inspector Alleyn prepared to leave Thornfield Manor, he reflected upon a case that had demonstrated the tragic consequences of inherited shame and the lengths to which respectable persons might go to preserve carefully maintained deceptions. The embroidered scarlet letter, secured in Scotland Yard's files, would serve as tangible reminder of the complex relationship between historical guilt and contemporary responsibility. Dr. Ashworth's crime had been both intensely personal and broadly symbolic, a desperate attempt to silence truth while transferring the burden of family disgrace. Sergeant Fox waited by the police motor with characteristic patience, his practical wisdom having provided essential support throughout an investigation that had required both methodical detection and psychological sensitivity. Their professional relationship, built upon years of shared experience with human frailty, required no elaborate discussion of the case's moral implications. "The most troubling aspect, Fox," Alleyn observed as their motor drew away from Thornfield's gates, "is the recognition that Dr. Ashworth's desperation was not entirely unreasonable. Her entire professional identity depended upon perceived objectivity. The revelation that her career was built upon concealment of the very scandal she had studied would indeed have destroyed everything she had worked to achieve. The autumn countryside, stripped of summer's concealment, provided appropriate backdrop for contemplating a case where truth had proven more destructive than deception. As evening settled over the English landscape, a small red thread caught upon the motor's door handle and trembling in the slipstream loosened and fluttered away into the gathering dusk, a final, silent commentary upon the persistence of inherited sin and the uncomfortable tendency of carefully buried truths toward inevitable resurrection. 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 Resurrection.